I was of the firm opinion that we should not share over Zoom to motivate you all to show up next time. But anyways, welcome to Intro to Lockpicking. I'm Datagram. I'm not pushing. Is that keyboard plugged in? Yes. If you care to know about me, I'm a covert entry specialist. That means I open stuff without breaking it. I'm also a forensic locksmith. That means I look at forensic evidence of locks and keys being manipulated or duplicated and so on. I also do a lot of security research stuff, so I presented a lot in the past with Swift and Cal Poly at other events like the Cybersecurity Fair on pen testing, hacking, binary exploitation, reversing. I'm told these have some subtle crossover with what you guys are interested in, so as far as if you want me to show up again, if you can bear with me for another presentation, then feel free to recommend to your fearless leader any of those topics, and I'm happy to come back. As far as locks go, I run lockwiki.com, lockpickingforensics.com, and I also run the LayerOne security conference in LA, as well as Null Space Labs. We're not at Null Space Labs, but if you want to check us out, we're LA's biggest hackerspace, arguably only hackerspace, depending on how you define the term. I usually say it's like the YMCA for nerds. So if you like hacking, electronics, etc., we have all that. Come check us out at meetup.com/nullspacelabs. Okay, so I generally forget to talk about this, so I put this in. As far as legal issues for today, there are 2 rules for lockpicking. The first rule is don't pick locks you don't own or have permission to pick. So with respect to the school, dormitories, etc., apartments, you don't own those locks, just for the record, even if you're in the dormitory or in an apartment, you probably don't own those locks. And this goes hand in hand with rule number 2, don't pick locks that are in use. So don't pick locks that you rely on. Don't pick your front door. Don't pick your car. Don't pick your back door, your business, any of these things. The reason for this is it's very small possibility, but it is a possibility that you break the lock or you break your picks inside the lock, making the lock not functional. It'd be a lot cheaper to buy a lock to practice on than it is to call a locksmith to replace this. So if you're interested in this, go buy a practice lock. California is what's called an intent state. So the possession of burglary tools, i.e. lockpicks in this case, is not a crime unless you show intent or caught in the act of committing a crime. So having picks on us today, not intent to commit a crime. Having picks on you at midnight in the back of the business administration building, probably intent to commit a crime, right? So if you follow these, they basically boil down to don't be an idiot. So if you can manage that, I'm sure you'll manage everything else. I'm a pretty chill presenter, as you may have already realized with the whole donut fiasco. So feel free to shout out questions. Don't worry about it. It's not a real class. You can interrupt me. You can have questions and independent thoughts. It'll be a really exciting moment for you all, I'm sure. I'm also super out of breath from dragging 100 pounds of locks from the parking lot to here. So bear with me if I have to stop talking for a second. The first thing we're going to talk about is handcuffs. And basically what we're going to do today is I'll shout at you for about 20 minutes, and then you guys are free to play with all the locks. We have lots and lots of locks to play with. If you joined from Zoom, well, show up. I don't know what to tell you. So for handcuffs are very simple. I'm sure, though many of you are young, you have many fond memories of handcuffs. But the basic idea of the handcuff is that it restrains an arm or a leg, right? Either arms to arms, legs to legs, or some variation thereof. And the idea is if you've used a zip tie, like a plastic zip tie, nylon zip tie, it's the same thing, but metal, more or less, and specifically designed for arms and legs. So this is a cutaway view of the handcuff. Inside are just a couple parts. First part is the pawl arm. So this is the arm that swings around and restrains you, right? Second part is called the ratchet arm, here in red. So the teeth of the pawl arm and the teeth of the ratchet arm interconnect the same way a zip tie does to prevent you from being able to pull the arms apart. It's just these metal teeth physically and mechanically detaining one another so that you can't pull it out, right? Underneath all this, there is a spring. The purpose of the spring is to push them together so that you can't just kind of shake it apart, right? And underneath all of this is what's called the double lock bar. So by default, you're in a single locked state. So you get this infinity thing going on. You can imagine that if your arm is in this, at some point this starts to hurt, right? So what the double lock does is it immobilizes the pawl arm, the blue arm, so that you can't tighten it further. And if none of you know what a handcuff key looks like, it's basically just a little square bit on the end of a post, and the square bit pulls the arm here. I think you could see that, yeah. It pulls the arm here back so that it physically separates the teeth. And if the teeth are separated just like a zip tie, then it's openable, right? The purpose of the double lock, if you look here, there's like a little dimple. So by default, that arm can lever down back and forth via the key. The double lock pushes this whole assembly forward so that it now is mechanically blocked from retracting. And if you've never seen a cuff key or a cuff up close, there's also a little pin over here on the right side of the cuffs. And there's a pointy bit on the end of a key, and that is actually used to push the pin in to engage the double lock. So via the keyhole, you can undo the double lock or undo the red ratchet arm, and via the pin, you can engage the double lock. So I actually need to not hold the mic for this, so this will be exciting. I just want to do this. I can hold it. Any ideas on how we get out of this?
Isn't there like a very specific way where you like to jiggle it and like some to keep them loose or something like that?
The question is, can you jiggle it and get it loose? Not really, because the spring is very strong. So like, it doesn't really work.
Yeah, wasn't like you like push it like not like this way, but like this way. That's probably describe how it like.
For our viewers on Zoom, there are fingers being pointed in different orientations to refer to different directions. Should have showed up. Not really. So how do you open a zip tie? Would be where I start.
Usually you get something underneath it to like stop the teeth from popping.
Correct. So you separate the teeth on a zip tie. Same concept here. Now, this joke usually doesn't go over as well, but many of you are engineering students, so this will be funny. But as an engineering student, you might go, aha, I will push over on this side of the red bar to get more leverage, right? Because of fulcrums and stuff. Again, we discussed, I didn't go to school, I don't know the words. You are correct. You would get more leverage if you go from left to right over here. However, you are fighting the teeth of the handcuff. And for most cuffs, it's very difficult. Oh, that's funny. For most cuffs, it's very difficult to get something in there because you are fighting the serrations of the teeth, right? So you might say, well, maybe I'll get something smaller, then it's weaker, it's harder to push on stuff. The correct answer against all logic and engineering school homework is that you go with the teeth. You push on the base of the lever, which is harder to get leverage on, correct? But it makes it very easy to get out of the cuffs. So what I'm using is a torque tool. We'll talk about these in a second. It's basically a bent piece of metal. Very exciting. You put it in, and like magic, you get out of the cuffs. Now, I assure you, these are very real cuffs. They're not police quality cuffs, but they are very real cuffs. There's no fuzziness on the side. There's no free yourself latch. You can get yourself cuffed and get stuck for a little bit. We'll only make fun of you until what, 1? Is that correct? Until 1?
Yeah.
And then we'll help you get out. Don't worry about it.
Wait, what's the difference in police quality? Is it just because like police quality usually has heavier metals?
They're just more expensive against physical force. They're functionally the same. I just don't want to pay that much money to have them get beat up all the time. So what happened? So I introduced a shim, a piece of metal that separates the teeth. I put it on the side where we're going with the teeth. The easy way to tell is that if you look at a cuff, there's a single metal piece on one side. There's a double metal piece on the other. You want to go with the double metal piece. Okay? Just think about it that way. You want to go on the side that's like the body of the cuff, not the swinging arm, the two pieces of metal side. You push it in, and you can directly actuate that bar into retracting, right? It'll be fun. I love breaking stuff at Cal Poly. I have a long history of breaking stuff. So you might say, well, how does the double lock work? Yeah, so the question is, are all handcuff keys the same? Kind of. So they are all very similar for bad handcuffs. There are fancier versions that have modified keys. But in general, yes, mini handcuff keys work on other cuffs. Not the same brand of cuff, but a key A will work on brand B's cuffs in general. Not always the case. Some of them do more fancy stuff, like this red piece is not a single piece, but it's 3 separate actuating levers, and they have like a wall between them. So the key itself has slots on it to prevent specifically this like key interchange thing. But in general, yes.
I'm curious though, because like I've actually seen police quality handcuffs before because I used to work with my dad at a police station. The same skeleton key could go through like a bunch of different handcuffs. So like buy all the same, or is there like a specific skeleton key that would like work? Because I would see like different kinds of handcuffs and stuff, and they all work the same. Well,
So I'll pass this around so you can see. This is actually a LAPD cuff key. They use a Smith & Wesson model something. This key has been modified. Sorry, put it with a Dremel, and this makes it work on a lot of cuffs. It still works on these cuffs. It still works on the police cuffs. I'll pass it around whichever way you guys like. Sorry. Police departments or law enforcement in general all have keyed alike cuffs. They all use the same key because it's convenient, right? You can transfer a prisoner between 2 officers and not have to worry about, oh, by the way, here's the key. Now, region to region, those cuffs may be different. Like, for example, in Europe, they use different cuffs. Some of them even use a keyed cuff, like we would think of like a door lock with like what we would say is an actual key. But even those are keyed the same for the whole police department in that region, or the law enforcement. Make sense?
So if someone just happened to have that kind of key,
yep,
if they understood like what kind of police department they were going through.
Well, let me preface all this by saying, if you are in custody of law enforcement, don't try to get out. Okay? I don't care about your political views on how ethical and blah, blah, blah. Don't try to get out. This is my strong recommendation to you as somebody who's been cuffed and beaten by police. Don't try to get out. Okay? Just wait, call your lawyer, do whatever you're going to do. But don't try to get out of the cuffs if you're in law enforcement custody.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of a situation where someone were to know which skeleton key that was.
Yeah, yes, if they knew, they could get out. But in general, you're searched for this sort of stuff. So, you know.
Question over there.
Question?
Yeah, you don't like always carry hairpins with you or something, so it's an action.
Question is, do I carry hairpins? I'm actually keystring like 12 cuff keys right now. Just in case.
But how many are hairpins?
No. Strict purist over here. Okay, so does this make sense? The next question you might have is like, how does the double lock work? And I think I double locked this just before we had a question. So I'm using a pick, but as we're passing around the cuff key, you'll notice there's a pointy bit. That's for pushing this little dimple. And then from there, albeit I have weak Packard arms, I still can't tighten this no matter how hard I try, compared to this one, which I can keep tightening, right? So law enforcement, as another example, are supposed to double lock you for your safety as well as like liability and other stuff, right? So just to prevent you from getting hurt, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So the question might be, well, how do we get out of the double lock? So the double lock is kind of interesting in that, yes, we can pick both the normal lock and the double lock via the keyhole. I would strongly prefer if you guys don't do that today because it has a tendency to break and bend the picks that we have here. Get your own picks, get your own cuffs. You can break them all you want them. But there is actually another way, and it's kind of a fun lesson about lock picking and like how we hold things together mechanically. Cal probably really loves it that I do this like once a year, but can anybody guess how we get this off? How we undo the double lock without touching the keyhole? We can't physically access it except via the keyhole. So what other things can we do? Inertia, I'm not smart enough to know if that's correct, but maybe. I'll do this and you tell me if it's inertia. You hit it really hard against something, which causes the, I'm working, he's nodding, so I think we're doing good so far. The kinetic energy will transmit to the double lock and knock it out of place, right? Very uncomfortable with this on your hands. And very important that you hit the right side of the cuff when you do this, or else you're gonna really have a hard time. Should be good. So now if the double lock's done, I'm single locked, right? So I could, if these are on my hands, then I can shim out of this, right? Make sense? You guys want to see me hurt myself, or was that like academic enough? Thank you, audience plan. All right. That makes sense? You guys are way too quiet. Is this like a real class?
No, I think I need to see you hurt yourself.
You gotta see me hurt myself.
Actually get a little for guilt.
All right.
Yeah.
Why don't I do this? Which hand do I need less?
Yeah, hey Steven, don't you want to come up here and do it?
Yes, Steven.
Yeah, don't you?
Oh, no, you're good. All right. So the
If not, I'll
question.
take one of the e-board members.
So you are welcome to try this. I would strongly recommend you don't do this on your arm because it's very uncomfortable. Double locked. Always check your double lock before you try this. It's a very life lesson I'm imparting on you. So you want to verify for the audience? Just use it this way.
Does it work,
Oh.
Manny?
Yeah, it's
Double
locked.
lock, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so I clicked it, make sure I can tighten it further. You know, when I went to Swift, they never made me hurt myself on stage. It's almost like-
Okay, but that means it works better, you know?
Right. So I undid the double lock. Thank you, audience planner. So you all can do this. You don't need to do the double lock thing. I guess like since this is a school and it's 2020, please ask for consent before handcuffing another person. Because people get real freaked out sometimes. I find it funny on a very personal level, but back to the rest. Please don't hurt yourselves. Please verify that it's double locked before slamming your hand against something. The easy way to remember which side you hit for the double lock is that you always hit where the pin is. Because if you don't, you're hitting this other side. Sorry, I'm pointing with my finger, like many of your professors, no doubt. But if you hit the blue side and it's not double locked, you will hurt yourself really badly. So don't do that, okay? So easy way to remember is that if I hit it on this side, I'm going to hurt myself. If I hit it where the pin is, I am not going to hurt myself as much, at least. Okay, makes sense? Questions so far? Terrifying. All right, so what we used is called a torque tool. There's many other things. There's what's called locksmith shims, which are floppy. I can take it. Sorry. They are floppy pieces of metal. There's a bunch of other techniques, so you can forcibly tighten the cuffs on yourself to pull the shim through instead of trying to manipulate the component with a tool. These things on the top left here are sold by locksmithing distributors and manufacturers. It's a like cuff shim officially, but you don't need anything that fancy. You could use a bobby pin, although they're a little structurally weak. They're flimsy. Torque tools from your basic lockpicking sets normally work very well. So far, so good. Okay, so let's talk about more traditional lockpicking stuff. I think cuffs are really good because everything you need to know about lockpicking you can learn from cuffs. Just in general, like fundamentally, it's very, very good. So play with them. I think they're very fun. Good party trick. What the world uses for 90+% of their locks is called a pin tumbler lock. And you all use this. I'm sure it's on your front doors. I'm sure every padlock you've ever bought has it in the US. Very rare to see anything but this in the United States. So from the outside, there's a couple pieces. This big piece is called the cylinder. The inner piece is called the plug. Easy way to remember this is that there's a hole in the middle of the cylinder that is plugged by the. Thank you, one person paying attention. I think you're all familiar with this part. What's this called? Keyhole, very good. The pattern of cuts on the keyhole is called the warding or the bitting. This differentiates when say a master lock key cannot go into a Schlage lock or vice versa. It's because the pattern of cuts on the key itself differentiates mechanically what thing can be inserted in the lock. And in general, each brand has their own keyhole, just in general. Inside's a little more exciting. There's a series of chambers. The common is 5 chambers. In each chamber is a pair of pins and a spring. The job of the spring is to push everything down to its default position. The red pin is called the key pin because it physically comes in contact with the key. The blue pin is called the driver pin because via the spring, it drives everything down to its default position. So what happens if we just try and turn this? So mechanically, if we just try and turn the plug, excuse me, the blue driver pin will prevent us from rotating the plug. And if we can't rotate the plug, we can't actuate a shackle or a deadbolt or a latch or whatever is on the other side of the lock, right? So the job of the key is to come in here and raise each set of pins in each chamber to the exact height so that they meet, the pins meet where the plug and the cylinder meet. Does that make sense? So like I said, a normal lock has 5 stacks of pins, 5 sets of pins generally. Key comes in. You'll notice that there are different sizes of key pins. So the key pins are bigger or smaller, and they correspond to a deeper or higher cut on the key. So bigger key pin, deeper cut on the key. Typically, we have 5-pin locks. Sometimes you have 4 pins on the smaller padlocks. Sometimes you have 6 pins for commercial locks or high quality locks. It's rare that we get to 7, 8 because as the key gets longer, it gets structurally weaker near the bow of the key, which is where you hold it over here. And then the other thing is that this little square bit here is called the shoulder of the key. This pushes up against the face of the plug so that all the cuts on the key are aligned with all the stuff inside the lock. If you've ever had a lock where you have to pull it out or push it in a little bit further to get it to work, it's because the shoulder is, in general, is miscut, or the cuts relative to the shoulder are miscut, right? Does that make sense? Great. So there's 2 reasons a lock doesn't open. Number 1 is that one or more of the pins is too low. So if it's too low, then the blue driver pin physically blocks you from rotating the plug and actuating the other stuff, right? The other is the inverse of this. If it's too high, if you go too high, then you're raising the red key pin higher than it's supposed to go, and it in turn will mechanically, physically block you from rotating the plug. Make sense? Okay, so again, you're all responsible engineering students, right? I love coming to colleges. I get to use this joke all the time. So your logical thought is that, all right, let's say all the pins in the lock are in the wrong spot, and I try to rotate it. Let's say I stick a screwdriver in there and I try to rotate it. What happens? Everything's in the wrong spot, therefore, everything blocks me, right? So this is a logical conclusion, right? Well, the answer is that the real world is not so pretty, right? So this is a very extreme example, but it's to give you some ideas of how not pretty manufacturing machining is. So any of you who have taken or have done any sort of like manufacturing or machining or anything like that, you know that you have this idea of tolerances, right? If I ask you to make a 1-inch cube, you're never going to get it perfectly 1 inch on all sides. And even if you do, once we start using that cube, or in this case, parts of the lock, it's going to wear and change, right? So when you make a 1-inch cube, you're making it 1 inch plus or minus 10,000ths of an inch, 100,000ths of an inch, whatever your tolerances are, right? But it's never perfectly the size you want. The same is true for every part of the lock. So the pins, when we make the pins, some pins are a little bit bigger, some pins are a little bit smaller, some are more oval shaped than others. When we drill the chambers for the lock, sorry, I point like an old person, I'm sorry. But when we drill the chambers for the lock, what happens if the drill bit breaks after we drill the first chamber? We got to put a new drill bit on. Well, that drill bit also has tolerances and differences, not just with its physical characteristics, but how it's mounted in the drill press and blah, 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 right? This is turtles all the way down, right? So what ends up happening is that all the pins are a little bit different sizes. All the holes for each of the chambers are a little bit different sizes. All the holes are slightly misaligned relative to one another. So think of like you're drilling you're going to have tolerances for how forward or backward, how left to right each of those different holes are, right? Now, just looking at this, it may be hard to spot those differences, but the end result is that all these little tolerance errors add up to make picking possible and most forms of lock bypass and other stuff possible. So what ends up happening is that the lock checks one pin at a time. Now, looking at the front of the lock, I can't go, aha, I know which one it is, right? But the way we get this information is via lock picking. So let's walk the dog a little bit on this. But does this make sense, like theoretically, right?
What part of the graph though, like whenever you stick a key in, okay, and like it's moving the pins and stuff. What specifically is physically blocking you from just putting in any keys or other?
So the key has to raise each pair of pins to the right specific height.
So is there like what kind of indicator would that be?
Let me go back to here. So right now, by default, all the blue pins block you. When you put a key or anything else in, it raises things. By default, yes, but you can get blocked by the red pins if your key or tool raises it too high. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So blue pin, in general, the blue pins are doing the blocking, but it's also possible to have the red pins. So it's not a matter of raising everything up. I'd be out of a job, right? It'd be really easy to pick locks then if you could just raise something up. Everybody gets this idea of binding. Binding specifically refers to the wall of the plug and the wall of the cylinder are trying to check if something's in the right spot. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's say we have a 3-pin lock, and let's say the biggest tolerance error is the alignment of the chambers, just to make it visually easy, right? So if we're rotating, the gray is the wall of the cylinder coming to check, which pin are we going to check first? One furthest to the left. Which one's that? The middle one. That's correct, right? So it comes and it checks if it's in the right spot. If it is in the right spot, it's allowed to rotate a little bit more, check the next one, rotate a little bit more, check the next one, and so on. So the key does this very seamlessly, right? You put the key in, you turn, this all happens very quickly. Lockpicking is exploiting this principle to figure out how to open the lock, basically. So imagine if we had a 1-pin lock. If we had a 1-pin lock, we could apply torque, that is, rotate the plug, and then we can slowly raise this until we get to the right spot, and the lock opens. So this is why we don't have 1-pin locks, because they're very easy, right? You'll also notice that when you rotate, the wall of the plug right here will hold the driver pin up. So this is kind of a key part of this, is that it kind of saves our progress as we're going. Does this make sense? The other thing we get from this is that if we correctly set a pin, and setting refers to like the feel of it snapping into place, or the sound sometimes of it snapping into place. Sometimes you'll feel the plug rotate a little bit, but I'd say that's harder. The other thing we get is that we disconnect the red pin from spring bias. So normally all the pins feel very springy, but we no longer feel the spring pushing back at us when we correctly set a pin in general. Does that make sense? Okay. So lockpicking in 3 simple steps. Number 1, apply torque via this torque tool. This is rotational force to the plug to get the lock to start checking what's in the right spot. At this point, 1 pin binds. Our job with the pick is to figure out which pin that is, which set of pins that is. The way we tell is that, think of how this works. Like by default, you have a spring just pushing back at you. It's very springy up and down, right? When you bind, the wall of the plug and the wall of the cylinder are pushing against the pin. Metal on metal is pushing and causing friction and other forces to cause the pin to be harder to lift. It feels heavier, harder to move. People describe it in a couple different ways. For me, it's harder to move is how I think of it. And once you set that pin, then the lock can rotate a little bit further, and then you set the next pin, and so on until you pick the whole lock. And as long as you maintain torque, that is, don't let go of your turning pressure, then the lock will save your progress, so to speak. Does that make sense? Question? Talk about it in a minute, but the question was, how much torque do we need? Will I talk about it in a minute? All right. So if you watch YouTube, they give you kind of a bullshit answer like 2 ounces of pressure. like as though we have like cognizance of like how many ounces of pressure our fingers exert, right? The real answer is that there's a trade-off. The harder you push, the easier it is to feel things, but the harder it is to move things. So there's a middle ground for every lock where you feel as much as you need to feel, but you still have freedom to move things around. Does that make sense? So I would say start heavy and back off. Some people say start light and work up. It's a personal preference thing, but there's no like magic amount because different locks have different spring pressures, different tolerances, different weights and sizes of pins, different materials of pins. There's a lot of variables. But I would say just start heavy and back off, basically, if it feels too hard to move things off. Most people say like if you see your hands getting white or your knuckles getting white, that's too much. And in general, that's true. If you're bending the torque tools, that's definitely too much, right? So it just varies lock to lock, but that's the trade-off. You had a question too? You'd want to schedule here.
It does save your progress.
That's correct. There's no functional difference between modern locks and this lock in the diagram for the most part. There are other types of locks which are different mechanically, but functionally all pin tumblers work on these principles. Somebody else had a question? No? Does this make sense fundamentally? So I'm actually curious to see if I could do this while holding the mic, but I'm going to pick a 2-pin in the interest of time. And then I will pick a master padlock real quick. All right, so what am I doing? I'm applying torque tool. Talk a little bit more about this in a second. I am right-handed, so I put it like this or in the web of my hand, depending on the size of the lock. A little different with a microphone in your arms. And then I'm going to go in. I'm going to try and figure out which one's binding. It's the first one, then the second one. And it's open. Ta-da. Very exciting. You can all do this lock, I promise you. You'll think I'm not very impressive after this. Additionally, we have a master padlock, which does have some anti-picking features, which most master padlocks don't, but this like soft metal, not stacked metal version of masters usually have security pins, which I could talk about more after the presentation. So there are mechanical things in here that try to dissuade you from picking, but in general, they actually make it easier. At least the feedback you get is better. Not that important. So, yeah, got it. I would recommend you all just come start picking locks. I could keep talking while you do that, but you need a torque tool, a pick, and a lock, obviously. If you want, there are some locks that say 1-pin, 2-pin, 3-pin. Those are good starter locks. If it doesn't say, it's probably 5-pin. Okay. Is there anywhere else you can usually outside? I realized we took that one. Yeah, me neither. Excellent question, sir. Let me talk about something real quick, and then we'll talk about which way to rotate. So the other thing you could do, as you guys are looking through the picks, you might notice that there are some weird looking picks in there. There's two kind of categories of picks. The first category is for like individually manipulating stuff. So like the hockey shape, the triangle shape, those are for manual manipulation. The other class of picks is called rakes, and these are for kind of brute forcing the lock. I would say raking is fine, but it is not going to get you to picking high security locks. It's like a easy and quick thing rather than a high skill thing. So if we think about how locks work, imagine we have a lock that has very similar heights for all the components. Imagine we have a lock that has a very small number of possible heights, or even a smaller number of pins, like a 4-pin lock. We can brute force it with the shape of the raking tool. So just putting the pick in and out of the lock varies the heights of stuff very rapidly. And as you're applying torque, that often leads to picking the lock very quickly. However, this is not going to make you the best lock picker in the world because it's a little bit less controlled. I'm going to skip the pick stuff, but you guys can do that. Question is like, where do I put my torque tool? Which way do I rotate? So there's a couple rules. So your torque tool by default should go at the bottom of the keyhole as shown in the picture here. The reason for this is that it's very sturdy. It's very hard to like slip and lose your place with your torque tool. But the downside is you have a little bit less room to work with for your pick in some locks. There are some flat tools on the table. So the idea for those is that they go at the top of the keyway. Advantage here is you have a lot more room to work with. However, they grip a lot smaller part of the lock, so it's easier to slip and fall out and have to restart your progress. The other downside is that if you look at the shape of this, it's possible to push up against the first pin of the lock and be unable to pick the lock because you're physically pushing against a pin and not able to move it. As far as turning, if it's a lock in your hand like this, just not a padlock, not mounted, these turn both ways because there's no mechanical restriction on the back preventing you from going one way or the other. Padlocks always turn clockwise. Always turn clockwise for a padlock. You rotate the plug clockwise to open a padlock. If it's a door, it gets a little more complicated. So if it's a deadbolt, you want to go into the door. Think of the deadbolt has to retract the bolt into the door. So depending on which way it's mounted, it could be clockwise, could be counterclockwise. But the base rule of thumb is that you retract into the door. If it's a key and knob system, so a latch-based system where you could turn a thumb latch on the back to lock it or unlock it, then typically it's lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. So if you are rotating clockwise, aka to the right, you will be locking the lock. If you go counterclockwise, aka to the left, it will be unlocking the lock in general. Okay, so like I said, I recommend you guys start with progressive cylinders. They are very easy. 1 pin, very easy to work with. 2 pin is actually the best training tool because you have to figure out which pin to do first. And this teaches you this like fundamental principle. And then from there, it's just more pins. You can also count the pin stacks in the lock by just checking it with the pin. If you push everything up and then pull your pick out, you'll hear the spring snap everything down. So you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pretty easily. And then the final tip I have is without any torque, feel how springy the lock is. This gives you a baseline for what binding feels like, right? You know how springy it is by default. Now you can compare to how springy it is when you apply torque and try and find that binding pin. But I know we're short on time, so that's all for the presentation. Let's pick some locks. I'm happy to stay outside in the courtyard if you guys want for a bit.
All right. Thank you guys for coming in. That will be the end of our presentation.